Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They called it the war to end all wars. 4,700,000 Americans went over there to Europe in the Great World War I. 116,000 of them never came home. Many more when they arrived back in the United States in 1918. Thousands of them died from the flu that they had contracted in France. They called them doughboys because of the look of their uniform. And one such person was an individual by the name of Frank Buckles. Frank Buckles lied to get into the United States Army. He was 16, and he went from recruiter to recruiter to recruiter, and finally convinced somebody he was 21. Got into the United States Army, went over there with the doughboys to end the war, to end all wars. He drove an ambulance and rescued other Americans who were fighting that great war. He said, we were typical cocky Americans. No one wanted us around until the French and the British needed some help winning that war. And just 19 months after the first Yanks arrived, the guns fell silent. Yes, that war ended on November the 11th, 1918. But that wasn't all for Frank Buckles. After he was discharged from the United States Army in 1918, he found himself in a place called Manila in the Philippines on December the 8th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked the day after Pearl Harbor. And Frank Buckles was captured by the Japanese, and for the next 39 months, he was held as a prisoner of war in a Japanese concentration camp. He was finally freed on February the 23rd, 1945, the day the Japanese had ordered his execution. Frank Buckles is the last surviving doughboy from World War I. Monday, he was 109 years old. He lives not far from here. Until he was 102, he drove his tractor on his farm in West Virginia. And at this time, I'd like unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to introduce a letter he's written to the American people on Memorial Day of last year.
Without objection.
After World War I was over with, that generation went into the Roaring '20s, then the Great Depression, and then they were the fathers of the greatest generation that went off to the Great World War II. I mentioned Frank Buckles for several reasons. He's the last surviving doughboy. This is a picture of him that was taken not too long ago in front of the D.C. World War Memorial that's on the mall. Now, Frank Buckles is spending the rest of his life trying to do something for those doughboys in World War I. You see, on the great National Mall, we have a memorial for the veterans of Vietnam, for the veterans of Korea, and for the veterans of the greatest generation, the World War II Memorial. But there is no memorial for the doughboy one that served in these United States. In fact, this monument, this memorial for the D.C. World War I veterans is in the weeds. It's not taken care of by the Park Service. And so what we are planning and what Frank Buckles desires is to have an expansion of this memorial and expand it to include all of those who served in the Great World War I. He says, I feel as the last survivor a responsibility to bring recognition to all of the millions who fought in that war, and they are gone. I intend to give all my efforts and time I have left to see that a national memorial of World War I joins the other memorials on the National Mall. I am dismayed that this country has erected memorials for World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, yet there is no memorial for the war to end all wars. So what we should do, members of Congress and Mr. Speaker, we should erect a memorial for that war that occurred in the last century. We should erect it for the doughboys of that generation, for Frank Buckles, who is 109 years old, the last surviving doughboy. We owe it to them. There are no lobbyists for the World War I memorial. Everybody's died. The only lobbyists are members of Congress and school children throughout this country, like Creekwood Middle School in Kingwood, Texas, that's raising money to pay for this memorial on the National Mall. And so what we as members of Congress do and need to do is to honor these great Americans that served in that great war, that war that we don't even talk much about in our history books anymore. We owe it to them. We owe it to Frank Buckles. We owe it to those doughboys. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.